Hi, my name is Stephanie Flint, and I am the co-creator of Infinitus Publishing, and today I'm going to be doing a reading from Chapter 8 of Magic Stealing, and in other words, this is also the first big test of I got a new Blue Yeti microphone for Christmas, so hopefully the sounds a lot better. I'm currently using that right now to see if that will help out with the sound quality, and I also used it for the actual reading, so hopefully the sounds will be a little more crisp, a little more clear. Let me know what you think. If you find that this, works better, definitely let me know so that I know, to continue setting it up and getting it, working and stuff like that. If you notice any problems, let me know so that I can try to adjust, different settings or adjust a little pop filter to try to make it so that it actually sounds clearer, because I want the recordings to come out, sounding good. Anyways, Happy New Year's, and I hope you enjoy the reading. Chapter 8. The air around the forge was cold, and the cave was hard to see. There and not there, like the grey mist obscuring the field below. Goosebumps tingled along Tarana's skin. Her hair prickled at the back of her neck. Tarana. Darren pointed to the edge of the path. Shadows. She raised her sight, then froze. While bright light glinted in the corners of her eyes, shadowy figures surrounded the two travelers. The shadows had knives drawn, and they were faded like ghosts. The cold seeped into Tarana's bones. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to breathe. She wanted to close her eyes and pretend the shadows were tricks of that terrible light behind her. But if she closed her eyes, she wouldn't wake. She tightened her hand around the hilt of her sword. She'd spent plenty of time in private lessons with Brocardon. She knew how to fight. "You shouldn't have come," a man said as he emerged from the cave. His voice was deep, more distinct than the shadow who'd spoken on the plain. He drew his weapon. An overwhelming light spilled from the scabbard and shimmered around his broadsword. The metal flared at the end of its blade like a diamond, bright and brighter. Darren and Tarana shielded their eyes. The man held his blade away from him, offering just a glimpse of his being. He was neither tall nor short, only a little taller than Tarana. His tunic sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing arms that were thick with muscle from a lifetime of blacksmithing. He wore an unbuttoned vest over his shoulders. His hair was cut shoulder-length and pale. Kafrash. She'd seen him in the Seer's Bowl. The mage eyed Tarana and frowned. "You're surprisingly young for being gifted with the god's magic. But you look familiar." His voice faltered. Darren raised his chin and jutted his jaw. "Why are you doing this?" The mage flicked his sword toward them and then addressed his subordinate. "Attack them. Use Glassstone. I need their powers, not their obedience." He sheathed his sword. The light lessened. Tarana quickly raised her magic vision so she could see her attackers. One by one, the shadows sheathed their dark, faded knives and extracted a thin, clear blade. The things were each made from one piece, carved as if from marble. They were clear like glass, but they shimmered as the shadows twisted their hands and the transparent material caught the light. The Glassstone knives seemed impossible, hanging from thin air. They were clearly visible now that the shadows had removed them from their sheaths, but the men themselves remained little more than faded imagery. All at once, the shadows attacked. They flanked Tarana and Darren, pushing between them until she had her back to the cave wall. A trio of shadows forced Darren toward the gaping entrance. A moment later, he disappeared inside, and a knife came at Tarana. She swung her sword to block. The impact knocked aside the shadow's arm. As soon as she blocked him, she anticipated the next shadow, raised her sword to parry, and then dipped to knock one of the blades to the ground. The shadow dove, trying to retrieve the Glassstone, but Tarana automatically thrust her knee against his head. She was surprised when her knee connected with a solid thunk, causing the shadow to reel backward. She pushed forward and kicked his blade off the ledge, then dodged an incoming swipe. The shadow on the ground grabbed her ankle. Tarana kicked her foot, frantic, but he yanked hard and she teetered, nearly dropping her sword. She tumbled. A roll later, she righted herself on the other side of the two shadows. They had just enough skill to be a pain, but they wouldn't be impossible to outwit. She feigned a strike, then punched the unsuspecting shadow. The shadow staggered, so close to the edge. She swung her foot into his side and gave him the final shove. He shrieked, his voice distant, followed by a thud from the ground below. She froze. She just killed him. Suddenly 2 more shadows were upon her. One grabbed for her hair, the other leapt. She didn't dodge the second man fast enough, and they sprawled to the ground. The hard stone knocked her breath loose. The shadow's fingers froze like ice against her wrist, and the air around him sucked the heat from her body. She struggled. She wrestled. She had to break free before the other shadow got in a strike. The other shadow brought his gleaming knife at her eyes. She twisted. The knife struck the ground behind her skull. It chimed like a bell, but didn't shatter. What kind of knives were these? The shadow atop her made the mistake of reaching for his shadow blade, the one she could barely see. She slammed her knee into his stomach. He gasped, his knee-tight grip around her waist loosening, and she rolled away. She fought for her breath as she reached for her sword, mindful of the looming cliff behind her. She let out a breath. The shadow who'd fallen to the plateau below had rolled onto his side. He pushed himself to his feet and gathered the fallen Glasstone knives around him. Her heart pounded. That man should be dead. A cold breeze near her ears gave her just enough time to spin around and block the shadow's blade with her sword. Her breath came hard, desperate. Parry, parry, feign. She had to distract these 2 long enough to help Dairnin. Parry and strike. She sunk a blow into the shadow's chest. She withdrew her weapon, exhausted and ready to take out the next shadow, but the first shadow didn't fall. He stood there, one hand to the wound. He bled silver on the ground as the wound closed itself and healed completely. Tirana stared at him. Impossible. The shadow glowered and attacked anew, rage flung through his screaming voice. Tirana fled. She didn't try to understand the shadow's words. She raced into the cavern after Dairnin, following the clink of Glasstone and the grunts of shadows. Her friend had backed into a rocky cove, but he was using that to focus his attention on the growing force of shadows in front. He shifted back and forth, thrusting each hand separately and delivering a blast of air or fire, to which they ducked and dived away. The shadows shied from the wind, but they hated fire. They scuttled aside when his magic seared their hands and scalded their weapons. They sent new shadows to fight, while they nursed their burns. Those burns seemed to heal, but slowly. One shadow lay dead on the floor, burned beyond recognition. He did not appear to be healing at all. Tirana shuddered. If these were mortal men, Dairnin wouldn't be using fire like this. But fire did hurt them, and these weren't mortal men. She swallowed hard. She wasn't good with fire, especially to control the kind of blast that would finish such an adversary in one blow. She gathered her breath and turned to find the other 2 shadows, now 3, because the one who had fell had returned, closing in. No escape. No way out except through shadow. For once she wished she had learned traveling magic, the use of ribbons to portal or run faster, or to suddenly appear anywhere with a thought. She readied her sword, but what was the use? They would keep coming. They didn't die. Except the shadow in the fields had said that mortal blades could not kill them. Her eyes widened. These shadows were magic. She could only see them with magic. What if they could only be harmed by those strange Glasstone weapons? The burnt shadow still had part of his belt, and on that belt was a Glasstone blade. She dove for the knight and wrapped her fingers around his scarred hilt and yanked it free. The hot glass burned her fingertips, but she ignored that feeling and rushed into the fray. She aimed fast for their waist, then flashed her blade at their throats when they tried to parry. One shadow went down, then another. This time, they didn't get up. They didn't heal. Elation carried her faster through battle. She could win this fight, get past the shadows, and then go after the fire mage. Another shadow and another, and she made for her 5th kill when a pained cry stopped her in mid-attack. The magic around her flared, glaring and garish. Dairnin's iridescent ribbons flowed into hers. Her senses brightened. Every shadow stood before her with crisp, grey outlines. She gasped for air. It was like she had been punched in the throat. Dairnin. She spun around, terrified, shocked, her mind stunned at the impossibility that Dairnin had been injured. Though the shadows stood in the cove before her, clouding her vision, her friend lay slumped behind them, a thick, bloody red gash torn through his neck and chest. Above him, the fire mage stood with his gleaming broadsword. The light coming from that sword was tainted with Dairnin's blood. Tirana bared her teeth, still clutching the Glasstone blade, and dove into the shadowy mass. She'd kill the mage. She'd kill his thugs. She ignored the cuts of their Glasstone knives, ignored everything but her own fury. They fell like wheat to the scythe. Kavrash waited patiently behind Dairnin, his sword raised. She let out a screaming cry and launched for him. He swung his sword. Before their blades could connect, lime-green ribbons flared around Tirana, wrapping round her chest, and yanked her back. Her breath left in a gush of air. She crashed into the stone wall. Pain shot through her shoulders. She blinked. The cave was fuzzy. She could barely hear the words of the fire mage as he argued with the cloaked figure before her. Another mage, one whose broad green ribbons had pulled Tirana back. The two gestured violently, until finally the cloaked figure shot violet ribbons from its hand and stormed through the resulting portal. Kafrash gestured to his soldiers, and they followed, leaving Tirana forgotten. She blinked again. The daze of being thrown into the wall was starting to dissipate. What in Shaw's name had just happened? She rose to her feet, unsteady. A quick glance around her revealed that the shadows were gone. She carefully stepped over their corpses and slipped into the cove where Dairnin lay bleeding. She dropped beside him. Dairnin? He had no magic. His brown hair lay in a messy clump, sticky in a pool of his own blood. His eyes were closed, as if he were sleeping, but there was no way he could have survived the wound to his throat. Tears streamed down Tirana's cheeks as she lifted him into her lap. She cradled his limp body against her chest, and her brain finally admitted that Dairnin was dead.